For months, this war has had a pretty predictable rhythm. The US hits military targets, radar sites, missile storage, naval assets. Iran hits back at American allies, and the cycle repeats. I've walked you through that rhythm in the last few videos, but something just leaked out of Washington that breaks that entire pattern, and I don't think most people watching this war closely even saw it coming. The New York Times reported, citing officials familiar with internal discussions, that President Trump has been briefed on a broader, more aggressive set of potential military actions against Iran. And buried inside that briefing is a detail that should stop you in your tracks. Some of the options on the table are specifically aimed at, in the report's own words, weakening the authority of Iran's leadership. Read that phrase slowly. Not degrading Iran's military capability, not pressuring Iran's economy, weakening the authority of its leadership. After 5 months of a war that's officially been about missile capability and shipping lanes through the Strait of Hormuz, the conversation inside the White House has apparently shifted towards something that sounds a lot closer to actively destabilizing who's in charge of the country. And it's not the only new detail in that reporting. According to officials speaking anonymously because of how sensitive this military planning is, the expanded menu of options includes what's being called limited strike scenarios, along with the possibility of targeted raids on key facilities, potentially placing American forces directly on Iranian territory. Not airstrikes launched from a base somewhere else, American troops on the ground inside Iran. I want to be clear about how big a jump that is from everything we've covered so far. This entire war, going back to the assassination of Iran's supreme leader back in February, has been fought almost entirely through airstrikes, naval blockades, and missile exchanges. Nobody has been talking seriously, at least not publicly, about American boots physically operating inside Iranian territory. That's a completely different category of military commitment with completely different risks and completely different implications for how this war could end. The reporting also says these updated proposals reflect what officials describe as a significant escalation in strategic deliberations, and that the options being reviewed now go beyond what the administration was considering earlier this month, when the focus was reportedly centered on pressuring Tehran to halt violence against anti-government demonstrators inside Iran. That's worth sitting with too. Even the earlier, narrower version of these options was already tied to Iran's internal politics, not just its military capability. This new, expanded version takes that same instinct and turns it up considerably. So here's the real question hanging over this entire video, and it's the one I want to spend the rest of this exploring properly. Is the actual goal of this war quietly shifting from degrading a hostile government's military capability towards something that looks a lot more like trying to change who runs that government entirely? Because if that's genuinely on the table, even as one option among several, that's not an escalation of tactics. That's a change in the entire nature of what this war is actually trying to accomplish. To understand how we got to this point, and why this specific option is even being discussed now, you have to see the full arc of how the target list in this war has already expanded, dramatically, over just the past couple of weeks. That escalation ladder is what actually makes an option like this politically possible, to even put on the table. To understand how weakening the authority of Iran's leadership became a real option on a briefing document, you need to see the actual sequence of escalating threats that led up to it, because none of this happened suddenly. It built step by step in public over the course of weeks, and Trump said almost every step of it out loud before it happened. Go back to early April. Trump gave a primetime address and threatened, in his own words, to bomb Iran back to the Stone Ages. Hours later, the U.S. military struck major civilian infrastructure inside Iran for the first time in this war, a bridge connecting Tehran to the suburb of Kharg. That bridge partially collapsed. Iran's state media reported 8 people killed and 95 wounded. U.S. defense officials said the strike served a military purpose, preventing Iranian forces from moving weapons across it, but a U.S. defense official told Axios plainly that more bridges were likely to be targeted going forward. Trump himself celebrated the strike on Truth Social, writing, "The biggest bridge in Iran comes tumbling down, never to be used again. Much more to follow." He added, in all caps, that it was time for Iran to make a deal before it is too late, and there is nothing left of what still could become a great country. That was in April. Notice how directly that maps onto what happened again just this week. Trump has kept using almost identical language every time he's ready to widen the target list, threaten first, in public, then follow through. On Tuesday of this week, he did it again, telling Fox News. Next week, it gets really bad for them, and warning specifically, next week comes the power plants. Next week comes the bridges. We're going to knock out all their power plants. We're going to knock out all their bridges, unless they get to the table and negotiate. Asked directly whether strikes would expand, his answer was simple. Ultimately, we'll hit energy targets. This is a pattern worth naming clearly, because I think it tells you something real about how this administration is fighting this war. Trump doesn't seem to treat these threats as private military planning to be revealed only after the fact. He announces the next phase publicly, sometimes days in advance, as a form of pressure in itself, daring Iran to come to the table before the threatened strikes actually happen. It's a negotiating tactic, layered directly on top of an actual military campaign, and it's happened at least twice now with almost identical wording. Stone Ages in April, power plants and bridges this week. There's a serious legal dimension to this that I don't want to gloss over because it's not a minor footnote. International law does restrict attacks on civilian infrastructure like energy plants and water systems. The laws of armed conflict allow strikes on that kind of infrastructure only when the military advantage gained clearly outweighs the harm caused to civilians, and legal scholars describe that as an extremely high bar to clear. Causing excessive civilian suffering in the process can constitute a war crime under international law. When a reporter asked Trump directly whether his pledges to target civilian infrastructure could amount to war crimes, his answer was blunt. He said he was not at all concerned about it. The White House, when pressed separately, said only that the U.S. will always act within the confines of the law in Iran, without directly addressing the specific concern being raised. And this isn't a one-sided legal question either, which matters for keeping this fair. Iran has already struck civilian infrastructure of its own, including a desalination plant in Kuwait that left tens of thousands of people without drinking water access, an act a former Defense Intelligence Agency official described flatly as a clear war crime in comments to The Hill. So both sides in this war have now crossed into legally disputed territory around civilian infrastructure. Iran through direct strikes on water systems in a neighboring country, and the U.S. through bridges and threatened power plants inside Iran itself. By the time you reach this week, the pattern is unmistakable. U.S. strikes have already widened to hit a port facility, energy infrastructure, and bridges across Iran, actively trying to squeeze the regime economically and logistically, not just militarily. Trump has publicly framed every one of these steps as leverage, as a way to force Iran back to serious negotiations. And every time Iran has held its position on the Strait of Hormuz instead of yielding, the target list has expanded again. That's the latter. Bridges, then infrastructure, then energy, and now, according to the New York Times reporting, potentially something aimed directly at Iran's leadership itself. Let's actually name the specific options reportedly sitting in front of Trump right now, because each one, on its own, would have been a major story a few months ago. Together, they represent a genuinely different kind of war than the one we've been covering. The Wall Street Journal reported that the options presented to Trump include intensified airstrikes, deploying ground troops to seize Iranian islands near the Strait of Hormuz, and bombing a site known as Pickaxe Mountain, one of Iran's nuclear facilities, something Trump has publicly mused about doing in recent days. Separately, Axios reported, citing 3 sources with knowledge of the discussions, that military officials have presented a series of options against strategic targets inside Iran that Washington has not previously attacked at all in this war. Start with Pickaxe Mountain, because the name itself is worth understanding. It's the informal name for a deeply fortified underground nuclear facility, built into a mountain specifically to protect it from exactly the kind of airstrikes that have hit the rest of Iran's military infrastructure this year. Facilities built this way are designed to survive conventional bombing campaigns, which is exactly why targeting it would represent such a significant jump in the kind of weaponry and risk involved. This isn't a radar station or a bridge. It's one of the specific sites this entire war originally claimed to be about back in February, when the stated justification for the initial strikes was destroying Iran's nuclear enrichment capability in the first place. Then there's the idea of physically seizing Iranian islands near the Strait of Hormuz using actual ground troops. This ties directly into something we've already covered, Kharg Island, Iran's main oil export terminal, the site of the strike. I walked you through a few videos back, where the U.S. hit 90 military targets while deliberately sparing the oil infrastructure itself. Trump has publicly gone back and forth on just how far he's willing to go with Kharg Island specifically. In an interview with the Financial Times, he said his actual preference would be to take the oil in Iran, a move that would require physically seizing the island. His exact words, when asked directly, "Maybe we take Kharg Island, maybe we don't." That's about as open-ended as a sitting president can be about potentially invading and occupying a piece of another country's sovereign territory. But here's an important piece of nuance the reporting also included, because it keeps this honest rather than purely alarmist. Some U.S. officials quoted by the Wall Street Journal said Trump has actually been reluctant to deploy ground troops after already walking back previous threats to seize Kharg Island once before. In other words, this isn't a president who's charged forward on every escalatory option he's floated publicly. He's raised the idea of taking the island multiple times and pulled back from actually doing it multiple times too. Both reports on this new, expanded options list stressed that Trump has not made a final decision on any of it, and Axios specifically noted he was expected to seriously consider these military options only if there's no diplomatic breakthrough with Tehran in the coming days. That last detail matters a lot because it tells you this expanded menu of options isn't necessarily a plan already set in motion. It's pressure, real pressure, sitting on the table, meant partly to actually be used and partly to make Tehran nervous enough to come back to serious negotiations before any of it needs to happen at all. Iran's response to even the idea of this has been about as blunt as its recent rhetoric has been throughout this war. Iran has threatened to launch its own ground invasion of Gulf Arab countries and to mine the entire Persian Gulf if U.S. troops ever actually set foot on Iranian territory. That's Iran drawing its own red line in direct response to this specific option of American ground troops. And it tells you that if this particular escalation actually happens, seizing Iranian islands with ground forces, it wouldn't stay contained to Iran and the U.S. alone. It would very likely pull Gulf Arab states, several of which have already been hit by Iranian strikes this month, into direct ground-level conflict as well. Meanwhile, the diplomatic track technically still exists, at least on paper. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman acknowledged this week that Tehran had received a 15-point proposal from the Trump administration, though he said there had been no direct negotiations between the two governments, and he described the U.S. demands as excessive, unrealistic, and irrational. So even while military planners are reportedly drawing up options that include troops on Iranian soil and strikes on a hardened nuclear site, there's technically still a written proposal sitting on the table that neither side has walked away from entirely. That's the tension defining this exact moment in the war. A real expanding menu of increasingly serious military options on one side, a still technically alive, if deeply strained, diplomatic proposal on the other, and a president who has shown repeatedly that he's willing to publicly threaten the most extreme options available to him without necessarily following through immediately. I want to bring in a few voices here who actually study this region and this kind of conflict professionally, because their reactions to this expanding target list range from blunt condemnation to a genuinely interesting strategic theory about where this actually ends. Start with the harshest take. Harrison Mann, a former executive officer at the Defense Intelligence Agency's Middle, East, and Africa Regional Center, someone who spent his career inside the exact institutions now advising on these options, didn't hold back when asked about the strategy of continuing to expand strikes in hopes of finally breaking Iran's control over the Strait of Hormuz. His words, given to The Hill, the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And that's exactly what's unfolding as Trump continues relying on strikes to try to shake Iran's grip on the strait. He went further, warning that by attacking Iranian infrastructure, including civilian targets, which he said may constitute war crimes, Trump is certainly courting a return to full-scale war. That's about as direct a warning as you'll get from someone with that kind of institutional background. Not, this is risky. Not, this could escalate. A former defense intelligence official calling the entire strategy insane and saying it's actively courting full-scale war rather than avoiding it. But Mann also pointed to two specific things that he said might actually make Trump de-escalate again, the same way he's flip-flopped on Kharg Island before. The first is pressure from the Gulf Arab states themselves, the countries that would bear the brunt of Iran's retaliation if this keeps expanding. We've already seen that retaliation happening in real time throughout this series: Kuwait's water infrastructure, Qatar's civilians, Jordan's airspace, Bahrain's air raid sirens. Mann's point is that as that pressure keeps compounding, those governments have real incentive to lobby Washington hard for restraint, since they're the ones absorbing the actual damage from continued escalation, not the United States itself. The second factor Mann named is a potential undeniable U.S. energy crisis, either from America's own strategic petroleum reserve draining as prices climb, or from Yemen's Houthi rebels closing a separate critical choke point called the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. If either of those things happens, the economic pain would start landing directly on American consumers, not just on Gulf allies overseas, and that's historically the kind of pressure that moves a White House faster than almost anything else. There's a second expert view worth hearing, because it offers a genuinely different theory about how this ends. Vali Nasser, a professor of international affairs and Middle East studies at Johns Hopkins, described what he sees as a kind of strategic calculation happening on Iran's side specifically. His read is that Iran is betting that Trump will keep trying to break Iran's back through escalating pressure, but that once the economic pain on the global economy increases enough, the U.S. will ultimately be forced back to the negotiating table to strike another memorandum of understanding, similar to the one signed back in June, that we already covered falling apart. In other words, Nasser's theory is that Iran isn't necessarily trying to win this war militarily. It's trying to outlast Trump's appetite for escalation, calculating that global economic pressure will eventually force Washington back to diplomacy again, the same cycle that's already played out once this year. Put Mann's warning and Nasser's theory next to each other, and you get a genuinely uncertain picture of where this actually heads, which I think is more honest than pretending there's an obvious answer. One serious former defense official is warning this exact strategy is insane and risks full-scale war. One respected academic thinks Iran is betting the whole thing eventually collapses back into negotiation anyway, the same way it did in April and June. Both of those things could be true at the same time. A strategy can be genuinely dangerous and still eventually produce a negotiated outcome, especially in a war that's already cycled between escalation and diplomacy twice before. There's also a documented pattern worth naming plainly here, because it's happened enough times now that it's not really speculation anymore. Trump makes an extreme public threat. The military follows through on some version of it, usually a step down from the most extreme framing. Iran retaliates against regional targets rather than directly against the American homeland. Global pressure builds from Gulf allies and energy markets. And at some point, usually weeks later, both sides end up back near a negotiating table, only for that same table to eventually collapse again over the exact same underlying dispute, control of the Strait of Hormuz. If this new, expanded set of options follows that same pattern, and there's genuine reason from both Mann's and Nasser's analysis to think it might, then the weakening the authority option and the ground troops option might function more as maximum pressure tools than as things Trump actually intends to fully execute. But I want to be honest about the limits of that comfort, because it's probably just pressure has been true of every single escalation in this war, right up until the moment it wasn't. The bridge strike in April was framed as pressure too, right up until it happened and killed 8 people. The Kharg Island strike was framed as restraint. Oil spared, right up until Trump explicitly said he'd reconsider that restraint if Iran keeps interfering with shipping. Reading these new options as probably just leverage is a reasonable bet based on the pattern so far. It is still a bet, not a certainty. Let's go back to the phrase that opened this entire video, options aimed at weakening the authority of Iran's leadership, and actually think through what that means given everything we already know about who's currently holding that authority. If you watched my last video, you know the man in charge right now is Mojtaba Khamenei, and his path to that position wasn't clean or broadly legitimate in the way a normal peacetime succession inside Iran's system would have been. I walked through this in detail before, but here's the short version, because it matters enormously for understanding this new option. Mojtaba spent decades operating almost entirely in the shadows, never holding public office, never even reaching the formal clerical rank of Ayatollah, despite years of studying theology. Reporting from Iran International described his actual selection as supreme leader as something the Revolutionary Guards effectively pressured Iran's assembly of experts into approving, sidelining the normal deliberative process that body is technically supposed to follow. And one analysis I found genuinely striking argued that the war itself, the same war we've been covering this whole series, was the very thing that made his succession possible at all. Because a wartime state of emergency let the regime push his appointment through fast, in ways a peacetime transition never would have allowed. Now layer onto that something else I mentioned before. Many ordinary Iranians reportedly didn't just fail to mourn his father's death back in February. Some of them celebrated it, even while Iranian security forces were actively shooting people in the streets for doing exactly that. A foreign policy expert quoted in Foreign Policy magazine described Mojtaba's appointment as a signal of what they called regime exhaustion, a sense among ordinary Iranians that after the assassination, after the economic devastation of this war, after months of mass casualties, the answer from the top of the regime was simply to keep power inside the exact same family and the exact same security networks that had run the country before. Put all of that together, and you get a leader whose grip on power was already unusually fragile the moment he took it. He didn't inherit broad public legitimacy. He didn't go through a process most Iranians would recognize as fair or normal, even by their own system standards. He got the job because a war created the emergency conditions that let a small, security-aligned faction push him through quickly. That's not a description of a stable government. That's a description of a government that's one serious shock away from a genuine internal crisis over who's actually in charge. Now go back and reread Weakening the Authority of Iran's Leadership, with all of that context sitting underneath it. If a government's legitimacy is already this thin, this recently and this visibly contested, you don't necessarily need a conventional military campaign to destabilize it further. You need pressure applied at exactly the right pressure points. Economic pain that turns public frustration from quiet resentment into open unrest. Military embarrassments that make the Revolutionary Guard's backing of Mojtaba look like a bad bet, even to the people who arranged it. Or targeted actions that make it clear to Iran's own security establishment that continuing to back this specific leader carries real escalating costs. None of that requires troops marching into Tehran. It requires understanding exactly how fragile the foundation already is and pushing in the places most likely to crack it. This is also, I think, the piece that connects directly back to Mojtaba's own words from my last video, the ones where he called the ceasefire memorandum worthless and invalid and promised Unforgettable lessons? I argued then that those words should be read as sincere rather than posturing, because his entire claim to legitimacy is tied to projecting strength during an ongoing wartime emergency. But that same logic cuts both ways. A leader whose power depends on looking strong during a crisis is also a leader who has the most to lose, personally and politically, if that crisis starts visibly going badly for him. If Washington's military planners genuinely understand how thin Mojtaba's actual authority is, and this level of detailed reporting on Iran's succession suggests American intelligence almost certainly does, then an option explicitly aimed at weakening. That authority isn't some abstract regime change fantasy. It's a targeted bet on a government that was already unusually vulnerable the day it came into power. I want to be careful here not to overstate this into false certainty, because destabilizing a government from outside pressure is genuinely difficult to engineer deliberately, and it often produces outcomes nobody actually intended or wanted, including outcomes far worse than the government being destabilized. Iran's system also has deep, multi-generational institutional roots: the Revolutionary Guard, the broader clerical establishment, decades of internal security infrastructure that don't necessarily collapse just because one specific leader's personal legitimacy is shaky. But the reporting itself that this option is on the table at all tells you that people with access to serious intelligence about Iran's internal politics see the same fragility I just walked you through and are treating it as an actual point of leverage, not just a talking point for cable news analysis. Let's zoom all the way out, because I think it's easy to lose the thread across 6 parts. And I want to leave you with a clear picture of exactly where this war actually stands right now. 5 months ago, this war started with a decapitation strike that killed Iran's supreme leader and dozens of senior officials alongside him. It produced a fragile ceasefire in April that took historic, first since 1979, direct diplomacy to arrange. That ceasefire collapsed by June, the same month it was supposed to be cemented by a signed memorandum. A naval blockade squeezed Iran's economy by an estimated $500 million a day. 7, then 8. Consecutive nights of strikes climbed steadily from radar sites to bridges to Iran's most important oil terminal. 2 American service members died this past weekend, the first U.S. combat death since March, and within hours, Iran's own supreme leader declared the entire peace framework worthless and invalid. And now, layered on top of all of that, we've learned Trump has been briefed on a genuinely different category of options: intensified strikes on a hardened nuclear facility, ground troops potentially seizing Iranian islands, and, most significantly, actions specifically aimed at weakening the authority of Iran's own leadership, a leadership we've established was already unusually fragile the moment it took power. Here's my honest read on where this actually goes, and I want to be upfront that I'm genuinely uncertain, because everyone who's given you a confident prediction about this war so far has eventually been wrong about something. The pattern throughout this entire conflict has been escalation, followed by exhaustion, followed by a fragile return to diplomacy, twice now. Trump threatens something extreme in public. The military executes some version of it, usually short of the most extreme framing. Iran retaliates regionally rather than against the American homeland directly. Gulf states and energy markets absorb real pain. And eventually, both sides find their way back toward a negotiating table, right up until that table collapses again over the one dispute that's never actually been resolved: who controls the Strait of Hormuz? If you're betting on history repeating itself, that's the most likely near-term path: more threats, some real strikes, real regional damage, and then another attempt at diplomacy within weeks. But I don't think you can watch this specific development, the leadership weakening option specifically, and assume it's just more of the same pressure tactic we've already seen. Every previous escalation in this war has targeted Iran's military capability or its economy. This is the first one that's specifically aimed at the people running the country. And given how thin Mojtaba Khamenei's actual authority already is, how openly contested his succession already was even inside Iran, that's not a small escalation dressed up in dramatic language. That's a genuinely different kind of pressure, aimed at a genuinely fragile target, and if it's pursued seriously, rather than just floated as leverage, it could produce outcomes far less predictable than another round of strikes and another failed ceasefire. What actually happens from here depends on things that are genuinely outside anyone's ability to predict with confidence right now, whether Gulf state pressure or energy market pain forces Washington to pull back the way it has before, whether Iran's own internal fragility, the one we've spent real time understanding in this series, cracks further under continued pressure, or hardens into unified resistance instead. Whether the diplomatic track, that 15-point proposal, still technically sitting unanswered, finds new life once both sides exhaust themselves again. And whether Trump, who has already walked back the Kharg Island option once before, treats this new menu of options the same way, as leverage he's willing to threaten but reluctant to fully use, or actually follows through this time. I've been tracking this war since it started back in February, through the ceasefire, through the collapse, through the blockade, through this weekend's deaths, and now through this. I don't think there's a version of the next few weeks where this quietly fades from the headlines. Whatever happens next, I think it's going to matter, and I want you watching it unfold with me rather than catching pieces of it secondhand after the fact. If this series has actually helped you understand a war that's genuinely hard to follow in fragments, subscribing means you won't miss the next update. And if there's someone in your life who's been struggling to make sense of everything happening in the Middle East right now, sending them, this is probably the fastest way to get them fully caught up.